He rode back into Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning, 6 years too late, on a horse that looked as tired as he did. The whole town saw it. Word moved faster than he could dismount. By the time Caleb Mercer tied his horse to the post outside the general store, 3 people had already gone inside to warn her. Abigail Reed stood behind the counter with a jar of dried beans in her hand and didn't move for a long time. Then she set the jar down, walked to the door, and looked at him. "Why now?" she said. "Just that. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let me see how far this one travels." The first sign of autumn came early to Red Hollow that year. A cold snap in late August that killed half of Nora Whitfield's garden and left a thin white frost on the water troughs by morning. By the time the sun burned it off, the town had already started its day, the same way it always did, slow, deliberate, and suspicious of anything that disrupted the order of things. Caleb Mercer disrupted a great many things just by showing up. He came in from the eastern road, the one that wound down through the dry creek bed and past the old Haskins property, which had been abandoned for 3 years now and was falling into itself board by board. He wasn't riding fast. That was the first thing people noticed. He wasn't running from anything, or at least he didn't look like it. He rode at the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, or maybe a man who had used up all his urgency somewhere else a long time ago. Jim Pratt saw him first, from the porch of the feed store. Jim was 62 years old, had lived in Red Hollow his whole life, and had a memory that other people in town both relied on and resented. He squinted at the figure coming down the road, chewed the inside of his cheek, and then went very still. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. "Hell." He got up from his chair and went inside. The general store owned by the Reed family sat on the main stretch of Red Hollow's single commercial street, wedged between the post office on one side and a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office on the other. It was a plain building, 2-story, with a covered porch out front and a sign that Henry Reed had painted himself 20 years ago. The paint was peeling now on the letters, and the porch boards had been replaced twice, but the store was still standing, which was more than Henry could say for some of his neighbors. Abigail Reed had been running it for 4 years. Her father was still technically the owner. His name was still on the deed. His opinions were still firmly present in every decision. But it was Abigail who opened the doors at 6:30 each morning, who kept the ledger, who haggled with the supply men when they came through and tried to squeeze her on prices because she was a woman, and they thought that meant she wouldn't notice. She noticed everything. She was 31 years old, which was not old by any reasonable measure, but which felt older than it sounded when you were the one carrying it. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a patience that had been built not by nature, but by years of having no other choice. She had a few gray hairs at her left temple that she neither hid nor mentioned. She kept her hair tied back while she worked and let it down in the evenings, and had, over time, stopped noticing whether anyone was around to see the difference. She had stopped expecting certain things. That was the honest way to put it. Not that she was unhappy. She wasn't most days. But there was a version of her life she had once believed in very completely, and that version had not arrived, and she had made her peace with that. She'd had to. Peace wasn't the same as contentment, and contentment wasn't the same as happiness, but she had found something workable in the space between all three, and she held on to it carefully, the way you hold a cup that has a crack in it and might still hold water if you don't press too hard. She was counting a delivery of salt packets when Nora Whitfield came in through the front door, moving faster than Nora had any business moving at her age. "Abigail," Nora said. Abigail didn't look up. "Morning, Nora." "Abigail, you need to—" "I'm in the middle of a count." "He's back." The salt packets stayed on the counter. Abigail's hand stayed on the salt packets. She didn't look up immediately, which was a choice because her whole body had already understood what Nora meant, and her brain was 3 seconds behind, trying to catch up. She finished counting. 42. She wrote the number down. Then she looked up. Nora Whitfield was 70 years old with white hair and the expression of a woman who had seen enough trouble in her life to recognize it at a distance. She was not cruel, but she was not soft either. She looked at Abigail the way people look at someone standing at the edge of something steep. "Caleb Mercer," Nora said, "just rode in on the eastern road. Jim saw him." Abigail looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, like she was confirming something she already knew and had already decided how to handle. She set her pen down. She walked out from behind the counter, crossed the store, and pushed open the front door. He was right there, not 10 yards away, just finishing tying his horse to the post, his back to her. She recognized the set of his shoulders before she saw his face. That hadn't changed, or if it had, her body didn't care about the difference. It registered him the same way it always had, with something low and involuntary that she immediately did not forgive herself for. He turned around. He looked worse than she remembered and better than she'd been telling herself for 6 years. He'd put on some years in a way that showed the lines around his eyes, the harder set of his jaw, the way he held himself like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and couldn't quite remember what it felt like not to. His coat was worn at the elbows. His hat had seen too many seasons. He had a 3-day beard and eyes that, when they found her, did something she wasn't prepared for. They just stopped. Like the rest of him stopped. Like walking into her line of sight had ended whatever he'd been doing and whatever he'd been planning and left him standing there with nothing. She was glad she was the one on the porch. She was glad she had the height advantage and the door behind her and the fact that she'd had 30 seconds of warning. She needed all of it. "Abigail," he said. His voice was the same. "That wasn't fair." "Why now?" she said. "Just that." No, she didn't let him answer. Not right there. Not in front of Nora Whitfield and Jim Pratt, and whatever other faces had materialized in windows and doorways along the street. She was not going to have that conversation in public. She had too much self-respect for that, and too much practice at keeping private things private. "You can come inside if you need supplies," she said. "Otherwise, the Dalton boarding house is on the far end of the street. They might have a room." She went back inside. She stood behind the counter and looked at the wall of shelves and did not cry, which was a victory she would allow herself to acknowledge privately. Her hands were steady. She was glad about her hands. He came in about 2 minutes later. He didn't ask for supplies. He stood near the front of the store, hat in his hands, actually took his hat off, which she noticed and hated that she noticed, and said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. You showing up is the trouble," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was reorganizing a shelf that didn't need reorganizing. "Red Hollow has a long memory, Caleb. You know that." "I know." "Do you?" It wasn't really a question. "I came back because—" "Don't." She turned around then. "Not today. Whatever explanation you've been rehearsing on the road, I don't want it today. I've had 6 years to build a life here without it, and I'd like at least one day before you take that apart too." He took that. Didn't argue, didn't push, just stood there and absorbed it, which was somehow worse than if he'd pushed back. She'd been ready to fight. She hadn't been ready for him to simply stand there and take the weight of what she'd said without flinching. He nodded. "All right." "The boarding house," she said again. He put his hat back on. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "I never stopped." "Caleb." He stopped. "Not today," she said. He left. Henry Reed was sitting at the kitchen table in the back of the building when Abigail came through the connecting door from the store. He was 64 years old, and he'd aged badly in the last 2 years. The arthritis in his hands had spread to his back, and there were mornings when he couldn't get out of bed without Abigail's help, which he hated, and she pretended not to notice. He was a proud man. He'd been a strong man once. The distinction between those two things had become the central tension of his daily life. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that had probably gone cold 20 minutes ago. He looked up when she came in, and she saw it. That was the thing about living with someone for a long time. You learned the difference between the ordinary expressions and the ones underneath. She'd seen her father surprised before. She'd seen him worried, angry, relieved. This wasn't any of those. This was something older and quieter and not comfortable, and it was sitting on his face in the half second before he got it under control. "Heard there was some excitement on the main street," he said. His voice was careful. "Caleb Mercer's back," she said. "I know." Too fast. He corrected himself. "Jim came by earlier, before you opened." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him and looked at him. "Papa," she said, "are you all right?" "Fine," he said. He picked up the cold coffee and drank some of it and didn't react to the temperature, which told her he wasn't tasting it at all. "You won't stay. Men like that don't stay." "What kind of man is that? The kind that runs when things get hard?" There was something off in the way he said it, too firm, like he was saying it to convince someone, and that someone might have been himself. She watched him for a moment. He didn't look up. "I sent him to the boarding house," she said. Her father nodded. "Good." She got up and put on fresh coffee and didn't say anything else about it. Caleb got a room at the Dalton boarding house for $3 a week, which was more than he could comfortably afford, and which he paid without complaint. The room was small, a cot, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back alley, and it smelled like old wood and someone else's tobacco. But it was a room. He'd slept in worse places in the past 6 years. Several of them. He sat on the cot for a while and looked at the wall. He hadn't known what he expected. That wasn't entirely true. He'd imagined this moment enough times over 6 years that he had probably expected too many things, none of them simultaneously possible. He'd imagined her angry. He'd imagined her indifferent. He'd imagined, in his weakest moments, that she might be glad to see him. He hadn't quite prepared for that particular combination of composure and contained devastation that he'd seen on her face in front of the store. She'd built something without him. He could see that. Not just the store, something interior, something that didn't need him in it, which was fair, which was entirely fair and also, privately, the hardest thing he'd encountered in a long time. He hadn't deserved to be needed. He knew that. He still hadn't wanted to see the evidence of it so plainly. He pulled off his boots and lay back on the cot and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about what he'd said to himself on the road. He'd told himself he wasn't coming back to win her back. That wasn't what this was. He told himself he was coming back because there was something wrong with the way he left. Something that had needed correcting for 6 years, and he was tired of carrying it. He'd told himself this was about truth. He believed most of that mostly. He fell asleep before it got dark and woke up at 3 in the morning when something moved on the roof. Probably a cat, probably nothing, and lay there in the dark listening to Red Hollow breathe. It sounded the same. Same creaking timbers, same wind off the open land to the north, same distant sound of someone's horse shifting in a stable. Same town. The same small piece of the world that had held the version of himself he'd most believed in. He'd left that version here when he went. He'd been looking for it in various places for 6 years. He was starting to think you couldn't find something that was waiting. By Wednesday morning, the town had formed its opinion. This was not surprising. Red Hollow was a small enough place that a stranger arriving caused comment. A known person arriving under known circumstances caused something considerably more structured. People had their positions within 12 hours. The positions varied in their particulars but converged on a general theme. Caleb Mercer had left Abigail Reed without explanation. Abigail Reed had carried the weight of that alone, and whatever he wanted now was 6 years too late. Some people were less kind about it than others. Martin Cross ran the barbershop next to the Reed's general store, which meant he had a direct sightline to the front porch and a professional obligation to be in his shop most of the day, and a personality that found both of these things extremely useful. He was not a mean man. He was a man who liked to know what was happening, which in a small town sometimes amounted to the same thing. He caught Caleb on the street Wednesday morning and said, "You've got some nerve." Caleb stopped. He was carrying a bag of provisions he'd bought from the supply wagon parked at the far end of town. He hadn't gone into the general store for his own reasons. He looked at Martin. "Morning, Martin," he said. "That's all you've got?" "I'm not sure what else you want me to say. An explanation might do for a start." Martin had his arms crossed and his expression was somewhere between angry and curious, which was a combination that on Martin's face usually meant mostly curious. 6 years, Caleb. You left that woman with nothing." Caleb shifted the bag on his shoulder. He didn't argue. He'd been on the receiving end of 2 similar conversations that morning already, from people he'd known less well than Martin, and he'd decided the only thing to do was take them without deflecting. "I know," he said. "Then what in the world possessed you to come back now?" "I had something to settle." "You had something to—" Martin stopped, looked at him differently for a moment. Something in his face shifted from aggressive to something more complicated. "You don't look good. I'll tell you that. You look like you've been run through a field backwards." "That's fair," Caleb said. Martin uncrossed his arms. He looked at the general store for a moment, and then back at Caleb. "She's not going to make it easy for you." "I know." "She shouldn't." "I know that too." Martin chewed on this. "You staying for a while?" "Long as it takes." "Long as what takes?" Caleb looked at him. "Long as it takes for her to hear what I came to say." Martin didn't respond to that. He looked at Caleb for a long moment with the expression of a man running some kind of internal calculation, and then he nodded once, slowly, and went back inside his shop. Abigail's day was bad from the start. It began with a delivery discrepancy. 12 bolts of cotton cloth ordered, 9 received, the supply man shrugging and saying she must have miscounted when she placed the order, which she had not done, and the argument that followed burning 40 minutes of her morning that she didn't have. Then her father tried to come downstairs to help with inventory, and his back gave out on the 3rd step, and she spent 20 minutes getting him settled in the back room and listening to him apologize, which was its own kind of wait. Then Dorothy Alcott came in at 10 o'clock and spent 15 minutes of a purchase transaction, telling Abigail that everyone in town was thinking about her, and that she shouldn't worry, and that men like Caleb Mercer always showed their true colors eventually. Abigail thanked her for the concern and didn't tell her to leave because Dorothy was a paying customer, and also because she'd been hearing variations of this conversation since she was 25 and had learned to absorb it. She did not want anyone's pity. She had never wanted it. She'd wanted, for a while, other things, and when those hadn't come, she'd reorganized. Pity was the thing people gave you when they couldn't imagine doing what you'd done, which mostly meant they'd never had to. At noon, she sat in the back room with her father and ate the lunch she'd packed that morning: bread, a bit of cold chicken, 2 apples, and listened to him tell her about a rumor he'd heard that the railroad surveyors were coming through again in spring. Her father had strong opinions about the railroad. He'd been having strong opinions about it for 15 years. She'd heard most of them. He seemed off, still. The same qualities she'd noticed the day before. Careful, slightly absent, as if part of his attention was somewhere else. She didn't push it. He'd tell her what was on his mind eventually. He always did, in his own time, and pushing before he was ready just made him dig in. He came to the supply wagon this morning, her father said, instead of here. She looked up. Who told you that? Jim. Jim should mind his business. Jim's 80% of my information. I know, she said. She picked at her bread. He was being considerate, or something like it. You think he knows the difference? I think he's smart enough not to push where he's not wanted. She said it more flatly than she'd intended. Her father heard the flatness and looked at her, and she looked back. You're not going to listen to him, her father said. Not quite a question. I don't know yet, she said. I told him not today. Today's not over. Her father was quiet for a moment. He picked up an apple and held it, and didn't eat it. Men who leave don't change, he said. That's the truth of it. Maybe, she said. Not maybe. You know what he put you through. She set her bread down. Papa, I was there. I don't need a summary. He stopped. Something crossed his face. Fast, shuddered. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. She stood up and cleared the plates. I'm not running toward him. I'm also not falling apart. You don't need to manage me. I'm not. You are. A little. She said it without heat. I can hold myself up. I've been doing it. Her father looked at his hands. I know you have. Then let me. He nodded. He still didn't eat the apple. What? She saw Caleb again in the late afternoon, by accident. She was locking up the side entrance to the store when he came around the corner from the alley. He'd been, from the look of it, walking the perimeter of the building, maybe examining the corner where the foundation had begun to settle and which she'd been trying to figure out how to repair for 6 months. They both stopped. That corner's been shifting, he said. He nodded at the foundation stones. You'll want to get under there before winter freezes the ground. If the frost gets into the gaps, it'll heave the whole thing. She stared at him. I'm not trying to he started. I know about the foundation, she said. I've been managing this building for 4 years. I know you have. He said it quietly, without the edge of concession or challenge, just as a statement of fact. It was an observation, not a criticism. She leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms and looked at him. The afternoon light was low and orange at this hour, the kind of light that made everything look a little more serious than it was. He looked tired, more tired than yesterday, which she wouldn't have thought possible. Did you eat today? She said. The question surprised him. She could see it. Yes. The boarding house doesn't have a kitchen. I went to the saloon at noon. They had something that resembled stew. That's a generous interpretation of the saloon's cooking. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. It was adequate. She looked at him for another moment. He didn't press. He didn't say the things she could see him holding back. He just stood there, in the orange late light, hat in his hands again. He kept doing that, taking his hat off, and waited. "I don't know why you're here," she said. "I want to. I hate that I want to." She said the second part with something almost like irritation. At herself, mostly. "But I'm not ready to have that conversation standing in an alley." "All right," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "After I close. 6 o'clock. He nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not—" She stopped. "Just be there at 6. She went inside. She stood in the back room for a while in the dark and listened to the town going quiet around her and thought about the expression on his face when she'd said the word tomorrow. Something in it that she didn't have a name for. Something that looked like a man who'd been traveling a very long time and had finally, unexpectedly, been told there was somewhere to stop. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood in the dark and let it sit in her chest, the way things sit when you don't yet know whether they're dangerous or not. Thursday came wet and gray, a thin drizzle that started before dawn and didn't commit to rain, but didn't clear either, just hung over Red Hollow, like indecision. The street turned to shallow mud. The horses tied outside the saloon moved around irritably. Somebody's cat sat under the general store porch and watched the weather with professional contempt. Caleb spent most of the day doing what he'd found himself doing since he arrived in town, being useful without being noticed. This was partly practical. He needed to stay busy or his head went to places he couldn't afford, and partly something older. He'd grown up doing work that nobody asked him to do because there wasn't anyone to ask. You noticed what needed doing and you did it. He'd never completely lost that instinct. He fixed a broken hinge on the livery stable door, which Earl Simmons had been complaining about for 2 months, according to Earl himself, who was both grateful and suspicious about who this stranger was and why he'd bothered. He helped old Clarence Foley get a wagon wheel back on the axle after it came loose in the muddy street, which took 40 minutes and left both of them covered in clay. He moved a stack of lumber that had been blocking the entrance to the post office, apparently since no one could remember when. He wasn't performing. He wasn't doing it so people would see. Most people saw anyway. Word moved through Red Hollow the way it always did, and by mid-afternoon the quality of the looks he was getting on the main street had shifted fractionally. Still guarded, still holding something back, but fractionally different. He didn't take it as encouragement, he took it as information. Ma'am, at 10 minutes to 6, he was standing on the main street in front of the general store. The drizzle had stopped an hour ago and left everything wet and gleaming in the remaining daylight. He'd cleaned up as well as he could with a wash basin and cold water. His coat was still worn at the elbows. Abigail came to the door at 6 o'clock exactly. She had her hair down, which caught him off guard in a way he hadn't anticipated, and which he worked immediately to not show. She had her coat on. She looked at him and then looked at the street and said, "Walk with me." They walked to the far end of town and then out along the trail that ran beside the creek bed, which was dry this time of year but held a particular kind of quiet that the main street didn't have. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and didn't look at him. "Start?" she said. He started. He told her about the day he left. He'd been planning to. He'd been planning what to say for 6 years in some form, and now that the moment was here, the planned version was useless. He couldn't remember it, or it sounded hollow, so he just said it directly. He'd been ready to stay. He'd been ready to ask her to marry him. He'd been saving money for 3 months. He'd been terrified and certain at the same time in the way you can only be when you're 24 and in love, and the whole future seems like one specific thing. And then he'd received a message. He paused on that. Abigail didn't say anything. She walked. "Someone told me you'd changed your mind," he said. "That you'd—" He stopped. "That you'd moved on. That you'd decided I wasn't. That the future I was offering wasn't enough. That you'd chosen differently." Silence. Just the sound of their footsteps on the dry ground and the wind off the open land. "Who told you that?" she said. Her voice was completely even. That evenness was not calm. He knew her well enough to know the difference. "It was a letter," he said. "Delivered to the boarding room I had at the Carver house. No signature, but there were—" He paused. "There were things in it that only certain people would have known. About conversations we'd had. About the specific plans I'd been making. Things that couldn't have been guessed." Abigail had stopped walking. He stopped too. He turned to look at her. Her face in the fading light was very still. "What things?" she said. "Where I was planning to take you. The place I'd told you I'd been saving toward. The words I—" He stopped again. He looked at the ground for a moment. "Things I'd told you directly. Things I hadn't told another person." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek bed lay below them, pale and chalked with dried sediment, and the first few stars were coming up in the east. "I didn't write you a letter," she said. "I know that now," he said. "You should have known it then." Her voice cracked slightly on that. Just slightly. She controlled it. "You should have come to me. You should have—" She stopped. "You should have come to me, Caleb. Whatever you received, whatever someone told you, you should have come to my door and looked me in the face and asked me." "Yes," he said. "But you didn't." "No." She turned away from him and looked out at the dry land. Her shoulders were straight and tense. He could see the effort in them. "So you just left," she said. "Because a letter told you to. I was 24 years old and I believed it because it was specific enough to believe and because—" He stopped. This was the harder part. "Because part of me had been waiting for it. Part of me had been waiting for you to see what I was offering and decide it wasn't enough. And when that letter arrived, I told myself I'd been right to wait for it." Silence. "That was my failure," he said. "Not the letter. The fact that I believed it because some part of me wanted to believe I was right about not deserving you." She didn't turn around for a long moment. When she did, her face was composed in a way that looked like it had cost her something. Her eyes were bright in the low light, but nothing was falling. "I spent 2 years thinking I'd done something wrong," she said. 2 years trying to figure out what I'd said or what I'd failed to give you that made you just—" She pressed her lips together. "I went through everything. I went through every conversation. Every time I might have made you feel like you weren't enough. I couldn't find it, and that almost made it worse." Caleb stood in the near dark and took that. Let it land where it was meant to land. "I'm sorry," he said. It was completely insufficient, and he knew that and said it anyway because it was the only true thing. She looked at him. He looked back. "I don't know what to do with you being here," she said finally. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this." "You're not supposed to do anything," he said. I didn't come back to demand anything from you. I came back because I needed you to know what actually happened. Whatever you do with it after that is yours. But you're staying." "I'd like to." "Why?" "Because I think there's something worth staying for," he said. "I could be wrong. I might be wrong, but I'm not leaving again until I know for certain." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the dark land. 6 o'clock tomorrow, she said. "Same place." He exhaled, slow and quiet. "All right," he said. They walked back to town separately, and the town was dark around them, and Caleb Mercer went to his small room in the boarding house and sat on the cot, and did not sleep for a very long time. And in the back room of the general store, behind a door she'd locked twice, Henry Reed sat at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and his hands and whatever it was he'd been carrying since Tuesday morning, and did not sleep either. Friday came in cold and clear, the kind of morning that made the whole landscape look sharp and brittle, like glass that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to hold. Caleb was up before first light. He'd given up on sleep somewhere around 4 and had sat at the narrow window in his boarding house room, watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale blue that preceded actual color, and he'd drunk the last of the coffee he'd bought from the supply wagon and tried not to rehearse the day ahead. He'd learned on the walk home last night that rehearsing was useless. The Abigail he'd carried in his memory for 6 years was a fixed thing, a photograph, and the real woman was not fixed at all. She moved in directions he hadn't anticipated. She said things that were more honest than what he'd prepared for, and he found himself stripped of his prepared responses within the first 10 minutes every time. He wasn't sure if that was terrifying or something else. He went out early and found work at the livery stable, which Earl Simmons was willing to let him do in exchange for a reduction in the fee for boarding his horse. Earl was a practical man who asked few questions about a person's history and several questions about whether they could handle themselves around large animals. Caleb answered all of them adequately. They came to an arrangement. He spent the morning shoveling and hauling and doing the kind of work that required enough physical attention to prevent the mind from eating itself. His back ached by noon. He ate at the saloon again. The stew had improved marginally, or possibly he was just hungrier, and then walked the length of town slowly, watching it move around him, noticing the ways it had changed and the ways it hadn't. The schoolhouse at the north end of the main street was new, or newer. He didn't remember it. The old one had been a converted barn. This one was proper timber construction with a real bell on the roof, and there were children pouring out of it at noon for their midday break, running in the particular uncoordinated way that children run when they've been sitting still for 3 hours, and the ground is wet enough to be interesting. He stood and watched them for a moment. There was a life in this town that had kept moving without him. He'd known that in the abstract, the way you know a fact about a place you can't see. Standing in it was different. He turned back toward the main street and found Martin Cross watching him from the barbershop door. "You're still here," Martin said. "Said I would be." People say a lot of things, but Martin held the door open slightly, which was either an invitation or a man adjusting his grip. "You want to shave? You look like something a coyote rejected." Caleb touched his jaw. 3 days of beard had become 4. "How much?" "For you. I'll do it for the conversation." He went in. The barbershop was warm and smelled like soap and leather, and the particular smell of Martin's hair oil, which had been the same smell for as long as Caleb could remember. Martin put him in the chair and got to work with the efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years and could conduct a conversation at the same time without breaking focus. "You talked to her," Martin said. It wasn't a question. "Some." "She say anything useful?" "She said what she had a right to say." Martin scraped the razor along his jaw with a practiced angle. "She's carrying more than she lets on, you know. Been doing it for years. Most people in this town think she's doing fine because she keeps the store running and she doesn't complain. They mistake quiet for all right." Caleb was quiet. "Her father's gotten worse this past year," Martin continued. "Back trouble mostly. But there's something else with him too. Something eating at him." He rinsed the razor and resumed. "Henry Reed was always a man with opinions. Now he's got opinions and something underneath them he can't figure out what to do with. You notice that?" Caleb thought about Abigail saying, "Let me hold myself up." He thought about Henry's face on the main street when he'd ridden in, the fraction of a second before the mask came back. "I noticed something," he said. "Henry never liked you much," Martin said, matter of fact. "I know. Even when you and Abigail were—" Martin paused. "He was polite enough to your face, but he thought you weren't settled enough, thought you were too much like the land, wide and possible, but not particularly reliable." He tilted Caleb's chin back. "His words, not mine. He said it to me once about 4 years before you left, when I asked him why he always looked at you like you'd tracked something in on your boot." Caleb processed that. "He tell you anything else?" "Henry doesn't tell. He implies." Martin finished the second side and assessed his work. "But something changed in him around the time you left. He got quieter, harder to read, like a man who'd done something he wasn't going to confess to." The chair creaked as Caleb sat forward. Martin handed him a towel. "I'm not saying anything specific. I'm just telling you what I observed." "I hear you," Caleb said. He sat with that the rest of the afternoon, turning it over in his mind, examining it from different angles and not yet knowing what shape it was. At 6 o'clock, he was at the creek trail again. Abigail was already there. She had a lantern with her this time, unlit, hanging from her left hand, and she was looking at the dry creek bed when he arrived, at the pale stones and the channels that water had carved and then left behind. She heard him coming and didn't startle. She'd heard him far enough out to compose herself before he got close, which he suspected was intentional. "Cold tonight," she said. "Getting there." He stopped beside her, not close enough to crowd, far enough to be respectful. The sky was deep blue in the west and black in the east, and the first real stars were out. "How was your day?" She glanced at him. The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard in its ordinariness. "Supply man came back about the short delivery. We argued. I won. A beat. My father tried to carry a box of canned goods, and his back went again." "Is he all right?" "He hates being asked that, but yes." She looked back at the creek bed. "He hates being cared for. He spent 40 years being the one who did the caring, and now that the direction is reversed, he doesn't know what to do with himself." "That's hard." "It's hard for both of us," she said. "He needs help, and he resents needing it. So I give him the help in ways that let him pretend he isn't receiving it. It gets exhausting." "You're good at that," he said. "At giving people things in ways they can take without it costing them their pride." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't used to be. I got better at it out of necessity." The honesty in that landed simply, without drama. This was what he remembered about talking to her, the lack of performance. She said things plainly, even difficult things, in a way that most people dressed up in protective language. She'd always done it, since they were young, and it was both one of the easiest things about being near her and occasionally the most uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about the letter," she said. "So have I. The things in it. The things only you and I would have known." She was still looking at the creek bed. Her voice was steady but careful. "What specifically did it say?" "I need to know what specifically." He thought about it. He'd been going over it for 2 days now, pulling the memory of that letter up from wherever he'd buried it. Not the feeling of it, which he'd never been able to fully bury, but the specific content. The words. "It said you decided the life I was offering wasn't enough," he said. "It said you told someone close to you that you cared about me, but not the way a woman needs to care about the man she's going to build her whole life with. That you deserved more stability, more certainty of a future." He paused. "It mentioned the Caldwell Ranch, that I'd talked about wanting to save enough to buy a piece of land there and build on it. It said you'd laughed about it with someone, that you'd said it was a dream for a boy, not a plan for a man." Abigail turned to look at him now. Her face in the early dark was very controlled, but something was happening behind her eyes that she wasn't entirely able to contain, and it wasn't the grief or the anger he might have expected. It was something narrower, something focused. "I never said that," she said. "I know. I never said anything like that to anyone. I know that now." "Caleb." Her voice was quieter now. "Who knew about the Caldwell Ranch? Who did you tell about that plan?" He looked at her. "You. And your father." The lantern swung slightly in her grip. She wasn't swinging it deliberately. Her hand had tightened on it. She looked away from him back at the creek, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the ones before. This one had a shape to it, a direction. "I need to think," she said. "All right. I'm not." She stopped. "I'm not saying what I'm thinking yet, because if I'm wrong, it would be a terrible thing to say, and if I'm right, it's—" She stopped again. "I need to think. Take the time you need." She lit the lantern then, though the darkness hadn't quite demanded it yet. She did it the way people do things when they need their hands to be occupied with something practical. The flame caught and put warm light on her face and on the dry stones below. "I'm going home," she said. "I'll walk you back to the main street." She didn't say no. They walked in silence, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at the edge of something and agreed, without speaking, to stand there for a moment before stepping closer. At the entrance to the main street, she stopped and looked at him. "Same time tomorrow?" she said. "If you want." "I want," she said, simply, and walked back to the store with the lantern making a small gold circle of light around her feet. He stood there until the light disappeared through the door. Then he walked back to his room and sat on his cot and thought about Henry Reed. He thought about Henry's hands around the cold coffee cup. The too fast response, "I know," when Abigail told him Caleb was back. The things Martin had said, like a man who'd done something he wasn't going to confess to. He thought about the letter and the specific knowledge inside it. The Caldwell Ranch. Words he'd spoken in a private moment to Abigail, in her own kitchen, with her father reading in the next room. He sat with the shape of that for a long time. He didn't have a name for it yet, or he had a name for it and wasn't yet ready to say it out loud, even to himself. Because some knowledge you can only approach gradually or it breaks something on the way in. He got up and washed his face and looked at himself in the small mirror above the washstand. "All right," he said to himself for no particular reason. He went to bed and, against all odds, slept. The next 3 days moved in a rhythm that Caleb hadn't expected to find. Work in the morning, small visible things around town, and then the evenings at the creek trail with Abigail. It was a rhythm built from almost nothing, a few hours a day, words that were careful at first and then less careful, silences that were becoming less loaded and more simply comfortable. But it had the texture of something real in a way that he recognized and tried not to press too hard on. They talked about the 6 years. Not all at once, not in any organized way. It came out in pieces, like things you find in a drawer you haven't opened in a long time. She told him about the first 2 years, which she described flatly as bad, and then, when he waited, as the kind of bad that doesn't announce itself as bad until you're already in it. She'd kept the store running, she'd taken on her father's duties as his health declined, She told herself every day that she was fine, and eventually that telling had become something close enough to true that she'd stop checking. "There was a man," she said on the third evening, "Thomas Aldridge. He came to town about 3 years after you left. Bought the old mill property, tried to make something of it. He was decent. He was—" She paused, finding the word. "He was steady. He asked me twice if I'd consider—" "You don't have to tell me this. I want to. I want you to know it wasn't just—" She turned a stone over with her boot. "I wasn't just waiting. I wasn't some woman sitting at a window for 6 years. I had a life. I had options." "I know. Thomas was a good man, and I couldn't do it," she said. "Not because of you, or not only, because I knew what I was feeling and what I wasn't feeling, and I couldn't stand in front of a man and make promises I knew weren't the whole truth." She looked at Caleb. "I don't know if that was virtue or stubbornness." "Might be both," he said. "He moved on, found a woman in Creston 2 years ago. They seem happy." She looked at the far dark land. "I was relieved. Isn't that strange? I was genuinely relieved." Caleb thought about the 6 years on his end. The places he'd gone, not particularly going anywhere, just moving because staying still made the thinking worse. Mining camps in Nevada, cattle drives down through Texas, a winter in Kansas that he didn't speak about and hoped never to revisit. None of it had been for any purpose that he could dignify with a name. He'd been running away from the place where the life he'd wanted was supposed to have been. "I worked a cattle drive through the Panhandle," he said. "Winter of '82. Boss was a man named Garrett, hard as iron and about as warm. I spent 6 months on that drive thinking every day about what you said once. When we were 19 and walking the South Trail out past the Whitmore property, you said—" He stopped. "You said you thought most people moved through their lives looking at the outside of things, and you wanted to live on the inside of yours." She was quiet. "I didn't understand it properly when you said it," he said. "I was 19. I thought it was something pretty that you said. But 6 months in a frozen panhandle, following cattle you don't own to a place you don't care about, it came back to me. And I understood it." She looked at him in the lantern light for a moment. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you ever said to me," he said. "That's been its own kind of problem." Something shifted in her face. Small and not simple. She looked back at the creek bed, and he let her have that moment without pressing into it. They were building something here. He knew it, and he thought she knew it, and neither of them was saying so directly, which was probably right for now. There was still too much unresolved. The question she hadn't answered, the one about who had written the letter, was still sitting between them, not gone, just set aside while they found enough ground to stand on to face it. Her father was the question neither of them had spoken aloud. Caleb saw Henry twice in 4 days. Once on the main street, from a distance. Henry was outside the store for a few minutes, talking to Jim Pratt, and he saw Caleb across the street, and the conversation stopped. Jim looked over too. Caleb nodded once. Henry looked at him for a moment with an expression that Caleb now recognized. It was not hostility exactly, and it was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had a version of events in his head that was increasingly difficult to maintain. The second time was closer. Caleb was helping move lumber at the back of the hardware store. Walt Briggs had asked him to help shift a delivery that had come in wrong, and Henry came through the alley on his way somewhere, moving slowly with his bad back, leaning slightly on a cane he clearly didn't want to be using. He stopped when he saw Caleb. Caleb set down the board he was carrying and straightened up. They were 10 feet apart. The alley was empty except for them. "Henry," Caleb said. Henry looked at him the way men look at things that are more complicated than they want to deal with. "You're still in town," he said. "Still here." "I heard you've been talking to Abigail." "She knows I'm here. She's choosing to talk to me." "She's too generous for her own good," Henry said. His jaw was set. "Always was." "She's one of the most clear-eyed people I know," Caleb said evenly. "I don't think she's doing anything out of generosity that she doesn't mean to do." Henry was quiet. He looked at the cane in his hand briefly, as if resenting it for being there. "You broke something when you left," Henry said. His voice was rough, rougher than the words needed to be. "You understand that? You broke something that took years to put back together. And it was put back together badly, because things that break badly don't come back right. And you're here now poking at the seams." "I know I caused damage," Caleb said. He held the older man's eyes. "I know what I left behind. I'm not here to pretend otherwise. Then why are you here? Because I was told a lie, Caleb said, carefully, quietly. I was told Abigail had chosen someone else. I was told specific things, things that someone would have had to know personally. That convinced me she didn't want me here. He paused. I've been trying to figure out where that information came from. Henry was very still. Not the stillness of the man caught off guard. It was a different kind. The stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and has just heard its footstep on the porch. That's an interesting story, Henry said. His voice had gone flat and controlled. It's what happened. Men tell themselves all kinds of things to excuse what they did. That's true, Caleb said. Some men do. He held Henry's gaze. I'm telling you what happened. The space between them felt different now, charged in a way it hadn't been a minute ago. Henry was gripping the cane harder than before. His knuckles had gone pale. Abigail is happy, Henry said. She's built a life. She doesn't need this reopened. She's the one opening it, Caleb said. Every evening at 6. She's asking me questions I think she already knows the answers to, and she's doing it because she needs to hear them out loud from me first. Henry looked at him for a long moment. Something happened in his face, a movement, deep and brief, like something shifting underwater. Then it was gone, and he was composed again, or as composed as a man can be when he's carrying something heavy that's getting heavier. Leave her alone, Henry said. Not with force now. More like a man saying the words because he'd committed to them and didn't know what else to do. Let her be. Caleb picked up the board. I think, he said quietly, that's going to be her call. He carried the board to its place and didn't watch Henry walk away, but he heard the slow, uneven steps receding down the alley, and the particular sound of a cane against packed ground, and then just the dry wind off the open land and the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business. That evening, he didn't tell Abigail about the encounter in the alley. Not because he was hiding it. He'd made a decision against hiding things permanently, but because he could see she was tired in a way that went deeper than the workday. She had dark circles she didn't have 3 days ago. She was distracted in the pauses between sentences, coming back a half beat later than usual. You're not sleeping, he said. She looked at him. I'm sleeping fine. You look like you're sleeping fine the way that stew at the saloon looks like actual stew. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That bad? That specific kind of exhaustion, he said, when you're sleeping but your brain's not. She pulled her coat tighter. The temperature had dropped sharply that night, real autumn cold coming down from the north. She stopped, started again. I keep going over what you told me, about what was in the letter, and I keep arriving at the same place and then refusing to go further, because if I go further, she exhaled, breath visible in the cold air. It changes something that I don't know how to change. He waited. My father, she said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a name, placed into the air between them like an object being set on a table. He didn't answer. He didn't confirm or deny. She didn't ask him to. She'd put it out there not for his response, but for the weight of hearing herself say it. I don't know yet, she said. I'm not ready to say it's true, but I can't stop thinking it. She looked at the stars. He was so certain you weren't coming back. When you first left, he was... She searched for the word. He was careful with me. Too careful. Like a man who knows exactly how bad it's going to be because he knows exactly how it happened. And I thought it was just that he'd never trusted you. I thought that was enough to explain it. The creek stones were pale in the lantern light below them, each one sitting exactly where the water had left it years ago, unable to move on its own. He loves you, Caleb said. I know he loves me. Her voice broke slightly on it, just slightly. That's the part I can't get past. Whatever he did or didn't do, he loves me. He's given his whole health to this store, to keeping me stable and safe. He sat with me through the worst of it. She pressed her lips together. And if he's the one who... She stopped. I don't know how to hold both things, she said. I don't know how to love him and be furious at him at the same time. You're already doing it, Caleb said. That's what you're feeling right now. She looked at him sharply, then slowly. Something in her face eased a fraction, the way things ease when someone names what you're feeling accurately and you didn't know you needed them to. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose I am. The wind moved through the dry grass along the creek bank, and the lantern flame held steady behind its glass, and the town behind them was lit and ordinary and completely unaware of what was unraveling in its edges. They stood there a while longer, not talking, both of them knowing that what was coming next wasn't going to be quiet, and not quite ready yet to make it start. The thing about carrying a secret for 6 years is that it doesn't stay the same weight. It shifts. Some days it's manageable. You build your life around it, learn its dimensions, learn which movements aggravate it and which ones let you almost forget it's there. Other days it presses down with the full accumulated mass of everything it has cost. And you understand, in those moments, that you have not been carrying it so much as it has been carrying you. Henry Reed had been carried by his secret for 6 years. He was 64 years old, and his back was failing, and his hands hurt in the morning, and his daughter had dark circles under her eyes that he had put there, indirectly, through an act that he had told himself at the time was protection. He told himself many things at the time. He told himself Caleb was not enough, that the boy was too uncertain, too untethered, too much like the wind for a woman who needed something solid. He'd told himself that Abigail would grieve briefly, and then recover, and then find something better, something real, something a father could approve of, without the cold worry in his chest that came with watching his daughter love a man who owned nothing and promised everything. He'd been wrong about the grief being brief. That had been the first thing he'd gotten wrong, and there had been others, but that one had been visible and daily, and it had cost him something he couldn't name and couldn't get back. He sat at the kitchen table on Sunday morning, 3 days after seeing Caleb in the alley, and listened to the store below him sitting empty on its day off, and listened to his daughter moving around her bedroom, and thought about the expression on Caleb's face in the alley, the steadiness of it. I think that's going to be her call. Not angry, not accusatory, just certain. The kind of certain that a man arrives at when he's been carrying his own weight long enough to know what he's made of. Henry had been watching them in the evenings, not deliberately. His bedroom window faced the main street, and from his chair he could see the far end where the creek trail began, and he had, on 3 occasions, seen them walking out together. He hadn't been watching. He'd just not been able to look away. He knew what he was watching. He recognized it in the way they moved, not close, not yet, but oriented toward each other the way two things are oriented when they share a center of gravity. He'd seen it when they were young. He'd spent a great deal of effort breaking it the first time. He heard Abigail's door open. He picked up his coffee cup. It was already cold. He did that without thinking now. Picked up the cup as a prop, something to do with his hands when she came in. She came in and looked at him, and then she looked at him differently. He'd been seen before. He'd spent 6 years being careful about what was visible on his face, and most of the time he'd managed it. But this morning he was tired in a way that went past managing, and whatever she saw in his face when she came through the door made her stop in the doorway and not move. "Papa?" she said. "Morning," he said. She didn't come to the stove. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with her mother's eyes, which were precise and did not let things go easily. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Abigail, and I need you to answer me honestly." Her voice was careful, not cold. She was working to keep it from being cold. He could hear the effort. "I've been thinking about what Caleb told me, about the letter, about the things that were in it." He set the coffee cup down. "The Caldwell Ranch," she said. "He told me about that, about how he'd been saving to buy land there and build something. He told me he'd only mentioned it to 2 people. She stopped. "He told me the letter described me laughing about it, calling it a boy's dream." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse shifted in its stable. A door banged in the wind. "I never said that," she said. "You know I never said that, because I never thought it. I was—" Her voice tightened briefly, and she controlled it. "I was 25 years old, and I thought that plan was the most hopeful thing I'd ever heard him say. I thought it was real. I was waiting for him to say it to me directly." Henry looked at his hands. "Papa." Her voice broke on the word. Not with grief, with something more frightening than grief. Certainty arriving. "Did you write that letter?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them afterward, in the way you count things that you want to be able to place precisely when you look back. "Yes," he said. Abigail didn't move. She was still in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and when he looked up at her face, he saw something happening there that he had spent 6 years trying to prevent and had caused anyway by a different route. He saw the version of her that had held everything together come apart, just slightly, at a single seam. "Tell me why," she said. It came out very quiet, quieter than he expected, which was worse than if she'd shouted. "Because I was afraid," he said. And then, because the word was not enough, and he owed her more than insufficient words. He had nothing, Abigail. He had a worn horse and a plan that might never amount to anything, and you were 25 years old, and you were looking at him like he was the whole world, and I knew that if he asked you, you'd say yes, no matter what. And if it went wrong, if he couldn't make it work and the land fell through and the money ran out, that was my risk to take, she said. I know. That was mine. Her voice rose slightly. You didn't have the right. I know I didn't. His own voice came out rougher than he intended. Not with anger. With the specific rawness of a man saying true things he has avoided for years. I know what I did. I've known what I did from the day I sent it. I told myself it was for you. I told myself I was protecting you from hardship. And maybe I believed that at the time. But there was... He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. There was also a part of me that couldn't stand the thought of you choosing someone I didn't choose. That couldn't stand watching you build something with a man I hadn't approved of. And I have not let myself say that out loud before now, but I'm saying it because you asked me to be honest. Abigail let go of the door frame. She walked to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, and the motion was very controlled, too controlled. The way motion is controlled when the alternative is something you can't take back. How? She said. How did you do it? How did you get things that only he and I... The night he told you about the Caldwell plan, Henry said. I was in the next room. The door wasn't closed all the way. He looked at his hands. I heard most of it. I heard him describe it to you, the specific land, the way he'd imagined it. I heard you... He stopped. I heard how you answered him. She was looking at him with an expression he didn't have a name for. It wasn't hatred. He'd prepared himself over 6 years for the possibility of her hatred, and what was on her face was more complicated and harder. And then you wrote a letter pretending to be from me, she said, and you made him believe I'd mocked him, that I'd decided he wasn't enough. Yes. And he left. Yes. And I spent 2 years thinking I'd done something wrong. Her voice was very flat now. 2 years going through everything I'd said, everything I might have failed to give him, trying to figure out what I'd done to make him disappear. She looked at the wall above his head. Do you know what that does to a person? To spend 2 years looking for a wound you didn't cause? Henry couldn't answer that. And then you watched me, she said. For 6 years. You watched me build the store and take care of you and turn down Thomas Aldridge, and you sat with me on the bad nights and made me coffee. And you knew. The entire time you knew. Yes, he said. The word came out like something being extracted. Did it? She stopped. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. She was not going to cry. He could see the determination in her shoulders. Did it ever occur to you to tell me? Any of it? At any point in 6 years? Every day, he said. Every day for 6 years I got close to it, and then He made a small broken gesture with one hand. I couldn't face what it would do. To you and to me. I kept waiting for a moment when it might hurt less, and that moment didn't come, and then more time had passed, and the weight of not having told you made it harder to tell you, and he stopped. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse. I know that. Abigail sat very still. Outside the wind came up again, and the sign above the store door swung once on its chain and settled. He knew something was wrong, she said. When he came back? He knew the letter didn't come from me. He must have been carrying that for years, too. The question of where it came from. I suspected he knew, Henry said, when he looked at me in the alley last week. Her eyes came back to his face sharply. You saw him in the alley. He told me he'd been told a lie. He said specific things, mentioned the Caldwell land. Henry's voice was steady with effort. He didn't accuse me directly, but he knew. He knew and he didn't tell me, she said. And then, he was waiting for me to get there myself. She said it almost to herself, working it out. Something in her face shifted. Fractional, but real. Not toward Henry. Toward a different understanding of Caleb, one that was arriving now and changing the shape of things. She stood up from the table. I need to go outside, she said. Abigail, I can't. She stopped. Her back was to him now. I can't sit in this room right now. I need air. I'm sorry, he said. He said it to her back because that was what he had. I know that isn't enough. I know there's nothing that makes this. Papa! She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. I love you. I want you to know that I love you, even right now, but I cannot talk to you anymore today. She went through the door. He heard her steps on the stairs, steady and deliberate, not running. The back door of the store opened and closed. Henry Reed sat at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and his cane propped against the chair beside him, and the quiet of a house that had just changed fundamentally, and he did not move for a very long time. Abigail walked. She went out the back of the store and through the alley and onto the south road without direction or purpose, just motion, because motion was the only thing her body knew to do with what was inside it. The Sunday morning air was cold enough to make her eyes water, or that was what she told herself. She walked for 20 minutes before she was aware of where her feet had taken her, the creek trail. She was standing at the top of the bank, looking down at the dry stones, in the place where she and Caleb had stood every evening for the past week. Daylight made it look smaller and more ordinary than it did at night, just a dry creek bed, just a cut in the land, nothing dramatic. But the stones were the same stones, and the wind off the open land was the same wind, and she stood there and felt the full weight of 6 years pressed down on her at once. She had not been wrong. She had not failed him. She had not made him feel like he wasn't enough. He had left because her father had put the right lie in front of the right man at the right moment of doubt. He'd left because someone who loved her had made a decision on her behalf, with total confidence in that love and total disregard for her right to make her own life. And she had spent 6 years believing it was her fault. She sat down on the bank, which was cold and dusty, and she didn't care. She sat there with the town behind her and the open land ahead and worked her way through it the way you work through something that doesn't have a shortcut. Slowly, methodically, looking at each piece. Her father had done this. Her father, who had sat with her on the worst nights, who had held the store together when she couldn't, who had loved her with every diminished resource of his failing body. He had done this. He had been afraid, and he had acted from that fear. And his action had stolen 6 years from two people who had done nothing wrong except love each other inconveniently. She could be furious. She was furious. It was in her chest right now, real and physical, a pressure that wanted to become a sound she wasn't going to make on the bank of a dry creek on a Sunday morning in full sight of anyone who came down the south road. She was also, sitting underneath the fury, devastated for him. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Knowing what he'd done didn't erase who he was, or the cost she could see it had imposed on him. She'd watched him carry it. She hadn't known what she was watching, but she'd seen the weight of it on his face for years, seen the careful moments, seen the way he looked at her sometimes like a man looking at something he'd broken and couldn't fix. She'd thought it was regret about aging, about needing her help. She understood now it was older than that. She didn't know how to be both furious and brokenhearted for the same person at the same time. And yet that was exactly where she was. She heard footsteps on the trail above the bank and looked up. Caleb stopped when he saw her. He'd been walking. She could see from his face that this was coincidence, or as much coincidence as things could be in a small town where there weren't many roads. He had his coat on and his hat down against the wind, and he looked at her sitting on the creek bank with the careful attention of a man trying to read a situation before he stepped into it. Abigail. He said it quietly. What happened? She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was full on his face, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had come a long way and lost a great deal and was still standing, not gracefully, but on his own 2 feet. She was aware with a clarity that surprised her of how much she did not want to be alone right now. Not in the way she'd been alone for 6 years. Not in the particular quiet of a life managed by herself, for herself, competently and without complaint. She was tired of that particular silence. It was him, she said. My father. Caleb came down the bank and sat beside her on the cold ground, close but not presuming, 1 foot of space between them, enough to be there without crowding what she was carrying. He didn't say anything for a moment. He told you, Caleb said. I asked. He answered. She looked at the stones. He heard you that night, when you told me about the Caldwell Ranch. He was in the next room, and then he... She stopped. The words still felt strange in her mouth. He wrote it himself. He knew what to put in it because he'd heard us. He knew what would make you believe it. Caleb was still. He was afraid, she said. That's what he said. He was afraid you weren't enough, and he was afraid I wouldn't listen if he just said so. So she made a small, short gesture. He decided for us. Are you all right? He said. No. She said it without drama. I don't think I'm going to be all right for a little while. That's fair. I'm not. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. I'm not going to say it's all right. What he did. I'm not going to arrive at some version of this where it's acceptable, because it isn't. He took something from both of us that we can't get back, and he watched me suffer for years knowing exactly why I was suffering. Yes, Caleb said. But she stopped. The word sat in the air. He's 64 years old, and he's been carrying it for 6 years, and it's been eating him. I can see that now. I couldn't see what it was before, but I can see it now, and I don't... She exhaled. I don't know what to do with all of it at once. You don't have to do anything with it yet, Caleb said. I keep thinking about how... She stopped again, then started differently. Do you know what it means? That it was a lie? Do you understand what it means? He turned to look at her. You didn't leave because you decided I wasn't enough, she said. Her voice was quieter now. The anger was still there, but underneath it, something else was surfacing, something that had been compressed under 6 years of managed grief and was now, cautiously, not knowing what to do with open air. You didn't leave because you looked at what I was offering and walked away. You left because someone tricked you, someone who knew exactly how to. Yes, he said. His voice was low. I built a whole explanation, she said. I built a whole architecture of reasons. Why I wasn't enough. What I should have said or done differently. I went over it so many times. She looked at him. And none of it was real. None of it, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, and the dead grass on the bank moved with it, and the stones in the creek bed were pale and still. She reached over and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a declaration. Just put her hand over his where it rested on the ground between them, the way you reach for something that you've been away from for a long time and that you're not entirely sure is still solid, and you have to touch it to know. His hand turned over under hers. Their fingers found each other the way they used to, with a familiarity that 6 years had not erased, that apparently 6 years could not erase, which was either a miracle or simply the truth about how certain things hold. They sat on the bank of the dry creek in the Sunday morning cold and didn't speak for a while. What do we do now? She said finally. He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that. She would have been suspicious of an immediate answer. I think, he said slowly, we let today be what it is. You've just had something break open. Your father's in that kitchen with everything he's been carrying now out in the room with him. That's enough for today. And after today? After today, we figure out what we're building. He paused. If that's what you want. She looked at their hands. I don't know yet exactly what I want, she said, but I know I'm not walking away from it again. Whatever it is. She looked up at him. I did that for 6 years and I'm done. He nodded. Something in his face settled. Not with triumph, nothing like triumph. With the specific quality of attention that has been held for a very long time, beginning, fractionally, to release. To your father, he said carefully. He needs to hear from me too. At some point. Not today. But at some point I need to talk to him directly. You're not going to... I'm not going to do anything except talk to him, Caleb said. He made a bad decision from a real place. I know what it is to love someone badly. I know what it is to act from fear and make it worse. He paused. That doesn't make it right, but I don't need to punish the man. She looked at him. You're being more generous than he deserves right now, she said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'm just tired of things not getting resolved. She turned back to the creek bed. The town was beginning to wake up around them. She could hear it, the distant sounds of a Sunday settling into motion, smoke rising from chimneys, someone's dog deciding the morning deserved commentary. She became aware slowly that the pressure in her chest had changed its quality. It was still there, still heavy. This was not the kind of morning that ended with things feeling light, but it was different. The particular compressed loneliness of a lie you don't know you're living had shifted into something more open, more like grief and less like confusion, and grief at least was real. Grief had a direction, grief you could move through. I need to go back, she said. I need to check on him. I know. She stood up and he stood up beside her, and they were close in the daylight, closer than they'd stood yet, and she looked at his face for a moment the way she used to, the way she'd stopped allowing herself to. Thank you, she said, for being at the right place. I was just walking, he said. I know. She almost smiled. You seem to do that a lot. She climbed the bank and went back toward town. He stayed a moment, watching her go, and then he turned and looked out at the open land and the pale sky and the distance that in every direction suggested the world was larger and less resolved than any one life could contain. Behind him, Red Hollow was fully awake now. The day was moving. The truth was out, sitting in a kitchen above a general store, and the people it belonged to were going to have to decide what to do with it. That was the work, not the revelation. The revelation was just the door opening. The work was what came after, when you were standing in the doorway with the cold air coming in, deciding whether to step through or back away. Caleb Mercer looked at the open land one more time. Then he turned toward town. The week after the truth came out was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not loud, just the steady grinding work of people trying to figure out how to live inside a reality that had been rearranged without their permission. Abigail went back to the store on Monday morning at 6:30, the same as every other morning, because the store didn't care what had happened on Sunday, and neither did the people who needed flour and salt and lamp oil. She opened the doors, and she counted the till, and she answered questions and made change, and nodded at the appropriate moments when Dorothy Alcott came in and said something that required nodding. She was competent and present, and somewhere behind all of it, she was also doing the slow, unglamorous work of absorbing a thing that had no quick resolution. She and her father had spoken briefly Sunday evening. She'd gone back to the store, as she'd told Caleb she would, and she'd found Henry exactly where she'd left him, at the kitchen table, though someone, presumably Henry himself, had made a fresh pot of coffee that was sitting on the stove going cold again. He looked smaller than usual, which was remarkable because Henry Reed had never been a small man in any sense she could remember, but sitting at that table with everything out in the open, he looked like a man who had set down a weight he'd been carrying so long that without it he didn't know his own dimensions. She'd sat across from him and they'd looked at each other and she'd said, "We're not going to resolve this tonight." "No," he'd agreed, "but I need you to understand something." She'd kept her voice level. "What you did, deciding for me, deciding what I could handle and what I deserved and who was good enough, that can't happen again. Not ever. Even now. Even with everything you think you know about what's best for me." "I know," he'd said. "I mean it. I know you do." His voice was rough and old and tired. "I was wrong, Abigail. I was wrong about him. I was wrong about what you needed, and I was wrong to think my fear gave me the right to act on it. I can't fix it. I can only—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I can only tell you I'm sorry and mean it, and I do mean it. I have meant it for 6 years." She'd nodded. She'd gotten up and put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Just for a moment, just enough to tell him that she was still there, that the love hadn't gone anywhere even if everything else was unsettled. And then she'd gone to bed. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning of something, and beginnings were what she had to work with. Caleb gave her space at the start of that week. He didn't come to the store, didn't appear at the creek trail on Monday evening when she didn't go, didn't press. She was aware of his restraint the way you're aware of something that is happening behind you. Not looking at it directly, but knowing it's there. He was giving her room to breathe, and she was grateful for it. And also, by Wednesday, she found herself mildly irritated by it, in the way that you get irritated by things you didn't know you'd come to rely on. She went to the creek trail Wednesday evening. He was there. "I thought you might not come," he said. "I thought so too," she said. "Then I got tired of my own company." Something in his face relaxed fractionally. "How is he?" "Quiet. He's been quiet all week." She sat down on the bank. She brought a blanket now, folded under her arm, a concession to the increasing cold that she'd made without acknowledging she was making it. "He came down to help in the store yesterday. Didn't say much, just stood behind the counter for a while, the way he used to, and counted things." She paused. "I think he needed to be useful somewhere." "Probably. I didn't send him back upstairs." She looked at her hands. "That felt important." Caleb sat beside her. The evening was sharp and still, no wind tonight, and the stars were coming up in a sky that had gone the color of dark water. You're not as hard as you're trying to be, he said. She glanced at him. I'm not trying to be hard. You're trying to stay on top of it. Keep it managed. I've been watching you do it for 2 weeks. He said it without criticism, just observation. You're allowed to be a mess about this. I've been a mess, she said, privately. That's very you, he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and less formed, but it was in the same family. Yes, she said. I suppose it is. They sat for a while in the cold silence. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. He didn't have one, and she briefly considered offering half, which she didn't do, which she then thought about for longer than was useful. What are you going to do? She asked. After... She stopped. What's your plan? Past staying in Red Hollow. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She'd learned the difference between his silences by now. This was the silence of someone finding honest words. I talked to Earl Simmons. He needs another hand at the livery on a permanent basis. His oldest boy went east 6 months ago for work that didn't pan out, and now he's not sure if the boy's coming back. He paused. It's not much, but it's steady income, and it's something I know how to do. And a shorter pause. Walt Briggs mentioned he might be selling the north plot, the one that backs up to the creek. It's about 40 acres. Not the Caldwell land, but it's good ground. Abigail looked at him. You're thinking about buying land, she said. I've got some saved. He said it plainly, without performance. Not enough for the whole thing, but enough for a down payment if Briggs would hold a note. I talked to him yesterday. He looked at the dark land across the creek. I know how it sounds, like I'm trying to build something before you've said whether there's anything to build toward. I'm not trying to force anything. You're buying land in Red Hollow, she said, turning the fact over. I'm considering it. If you told me right now that you wanted me out of this town by spring, I'd... He stopped. He said the next part carefully. I'd leave. Because I said what happens next is your call, and I meant that. But if you're not telling me that, I'm not telling you that, she said. The stillness between them was different from the stillnesses of the first week. Less guarded. Something in it was beginning to feel like the particular quiet of two people who have run out of the specific tension that comes from not knowing where they stand. 40 acres, she said. Small house on it eventually. Livery work in the meantime. He shrugged, and the shrug was honest, not trying to make it sound like more. It's not the Caldwell Ranch. No, she agreed. Then, the Caldwell plan was a young man's plan. This one sounds like a real one. He looked at her. Something in his face was very careful and very still, the way people look when they're holding something they don't want to drop. Yes, he said. That's what it is. She stood up eventually, as she always did, and he walked her back to the main street, as he'd started doing, and they parted at the corner, as was their pattern. But this time she stopped at the door to the store and turned back. Come for supper on Friday, she said. I'll cook. He looked at her for a moment. Your father... I'll tell him. She held his gaze. He doesn't get to decide. Not anymore. She paused. But I also think it's time you two talk directly. So, Friday, 6 o'clock. He didn't say, are you sure? She appreciated that. All right, he said. She went inside. The week moved. Caleb worked mornings at the livery and spent afternoons doing the accumulated repair work that Red Hollow had been accumulating for years, and had no one particular person assigned to address. He fixed the corner of the general store's foundation. He came one afternoon while Abigail was inside, and she watched through the side window without acknowledging she was watching as he dug down alongside the shifted stones with a methodical patience that was very much his own, packing new mortar in the gaps by hand, working carefully, not rushing. It took the better part of 3 hours. He cleaned up afterward, gathered his tools, and left without coming in to announce he'd done it. She found the repair the next morning. She stood and looked at it for a moment, the neat packed mortar, the re-leveled stones at the corner where the building had been slowly losing its argument with the earth. Then she went inside and made the coffee and didn't mention it. He came for supper on Friday. She'd made a proper meal, venison stew, biscuits, preserved apples from the cellar, and she'd set the table in the back room with the good plates, which she hadn't used in several years, and she'd told her father that morning in a tone that didn't leave room for discussion. He's coming for supper tonight, she'd said. Her father had been sitting in his chair by the window, the winter light coming through thin and gray on his hands. He'd looked at her and then looked out the window. "All right," he'd said. "I mean it about what I said last Sunday." "I know you do. I need you to behave like the man I know you actually are, not the man who's afraid." Her father had looked at his hands for a long moment. "I'll try," he said. "That's the honest answer. I'll try." She'd accepted that. Caleb knocked at 6 exactly. She let him in through the store's back entrance, and he came in with his hat in his hands and a small, paper-wrapped package that turned out to be a jar of preserves, peach, which he'd apparently bought from Nora Whitfield's front porch sale. And she took it without comment, which was its own kind of comment. Henry was already at the table when they came through. The three of them sat down, and Abigail put the food on the table, and for the first 3 minutes no one said anything of significance. She'd expected that. She'd prepared for it by making sure there was enough food that the practical business of serving and passing and eating could carry the first stretch of conversation. It was her father who spoke first. "The foundation corner," he said. He was looking at his plate. "Abigail showed me this morning." Caleb looked up. It needed doing before the ground froze. She'd been trying to figure out how to afford the mason from Creston. Henry's voice was even and careful. "He wanted $14 for the job." "It wasn't a $14 job," Caleb said. "It just needed someone willing to get on their knees in the cold for a few hours." A short silence. "Thank you," Henry said. He said it the way men say things they mean and don't know how to dress up, flatly, directly, without ceremony. Caleb nodded once. "It's a good building, worth keeping right." Another silence, but this one was different. Something in it had shifted. Abigail ate her stew and let them find their way. It was later, after the plates were cleared, after she'd made coffee, and the three of them were sitting with it in the back room with the lanterns lit against the dark outside, that her father looked across the table at Caleb and said, "I owe you something." Caleb didn't move. He held his coffee cup and waited. "I don't—" Henry stopped. He looked at his hands, then back up. "I don't have an explanation that makes what I did reasonable. I had reasons. They were real to me at the time. But reasons aren't the same as rights, and I had no right to decide your life for either of you." He paused. "I'm telling you that directly. I'm telling you I was wrong." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Abigail watched his face, the way it worked through something. "I know why you did it," Caleb said finally. "You thought I was going to fail her. You thought I was going to take her out into the world with nothing solid under my feet, and she was going to fall." He looked at Henry steadily. "You weren't wrong about what I had. I had almost nothing. You were wrong about what I was going to do about it." Henry didn't argue that. "I was 24 years old," Caleb continued, "and I believed the letter because part of me had been waiting for a reason to believe I wasn't enough. That's not on you. That's my own failure. I should have come to her directly." He paused. "But the letter gave that fear a direction. And a man who's already afraid doesn't need much more than a direction." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the street, rattling something loose somewhere down the block. "I can't give you the years back," Henry said. "No," Caleb said. "I can't make the damage less than it is." "No." Henry looked at him. "What do you want from me, honestly?" Caleb thought about it. It wasn't a short thought. He sat with it for a real moment. Long enough that both Abigail and her father understood he was actually considering rather than reaching for a prepared answer. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything from you, Henry. I want to build something here. I want to show both of you, not just Abigail, that I am what I say I am, and I'll do what I say I'll do. That's what I want to do. Whether you believe it eventually is your business." Henry looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Abigail. She met his eyes and didn't look away. Something passed across his face, the specific expression of a man who understands, fully and finally, that he is no longer the main character in his daughter's story, and who is deciding how to feel about that. It wasn't a small thing, what she saw in his face. It was an old man letting go of something he'd held with both hands for a very long time. He picked up his coffee. "The North Plot Walt Briggs has," he said. His voice had shifted to something more conversational, careful in a new way. "What are you thinking for it?" Caleb looked at him, slightly surprised at the turn, then adapted. "Small house to start. Maybe a second structure for equipment eventually. I've got some skills building. Did it for a contractor in Nevada for 2 years." North Plot's got a water problem in spring, Henry said. The runoff from the ridge comes through the northeast corner. You'd need to ditch it, or the ground stays wet till June. I figured something like that. I want to walk it properly before I talk to Briggs about the note. I walked it 20 years ago when I was thinking about expanding. Henry looked at the table. The northeast corner's the problem, but the rest of it's good. Deep soil. Couple of old cottonwoods on the south edge that give good shade in summer. Abigail looked between them. Neither of them acknowledged her looking. They were doing what men sometimes do when the emotional part of something is too large to maintain directly. They'd moved it sideways, into practical ground, into the language of soil and water and structures, where they could continue to be in the same room without the weight of everything else crushing the air. She let them. She refilled the coffee and sat back down and let the conversation move into the North Plot's drainage problems. And she listened to her father's voice lose some of its careful guardedness and become something more like the voice she'd grown up with. The voice of a man who knew this land and had opinions about it and was not afraid to share them, and she understood that this was not resolution. They were nowhere near resolution, any of them, but it was a room with 3 people in it who were all still present, all still trying, and that was not nothing. It was in fact quite a lot. The weeks that followed had a texture to them that Abigail hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not exactly. It was more complicated than that, and she was too honest with herself to call it something simpler than it was. But there was a quality of motion to her days that had been absent. Things were moving. Things that had been stuck were becoming unstuck, and the process was not smooth. Things that have been stuck for a long time don't come free without resistance. But it was real. Caleb put down money on the North Plot. Walt Briggs held the note at fair interest, which Abigail suspected had something to do with Martin Cross, who had apparently had a conversation with Walt about Caleb that Martin neither confirmed nor denied when she asked him directly. "I don't know what you're referring to," Martin said, with the expression of a man who knew exactly what she was referring to. "You talked to Walt Briggs," she said. "I talk to Walt Briggs twice a week. He's my neighbor." "Martin." He looked at her over the tops of his glasses. "I may have mentioned to Walt that Caleb Mercer is a man of his word, and that there are people in this town who can speak to his character." He paused. "That's not interference. That's information." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the thread and the button she'd come in to buy and said, "Thank you, Martin." "I don't know what you're thanking me for," he said, and went back to his barbering. Caleb broke ground on the North Plot on the second Saturday of October. It was too late in the season to do much of real substance. The ground would be frozen solid in 6 weeks. But he cleared the brush from the building site, marked the corners, dug the first section of drainage ditch along the northeast edge, as Henry had suggested. Henry came out that afternoon on a day when his back was cooperating, moving slow with his cane, and stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at the layout. Caleb stopped working when he saw him coming. They stood together and looked at the staked-out corners. "You've got it oriented right," Henry said. "South-facing. You'll get the winter light." "That was the idea." Henry looked at the drainage trench. "Goes deep enough?" "I'll go another foot before I'm done." Henry nodded. He looked at the 2 cottonwoods on the south edge, their leaves gone now, their bare branches making a particular pattern against the pale sky. "My wife used to say you could tell what a man valued by what he kept and what he cleared," he said. "When we built the store, I cleared everything. She thought that was very me." Caleb looked at the cottonwoods. "I'm keeping those." Henry was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it roughly, without looking at Caleb, like a man putting something down on a table and walking away from it. "My wife. She had better judgment about people than I did." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked at the old man standing in the cold afternoon light, diminished and honest and carrying the particular dignity of a person who has stopped pretending. "I'm sorry she's gone," Caleb said. Henry nodded once. He turned and made his slow way back toward the main road. Caleb watched him go and then went back to digging. Abigail heard about it from her father that evening. The whole account of it, told at the kitchen table with a plainness that was, she understood, the closest her father was going to come to something like absolution. He told her what he'd said about her mother. He told her what Caleb had answered. He told it without editorializing, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for going out there." "I needed to see what he was doing with it," Henry said. "The land." "And?" He looked at his hands. "He's doing it right," he said, "taking his time." thinking it through. He was quiet for a moment. He's not the boy I was afraid of. I think... He stopped. I think he was probably never entirely the boy I was afraid of. I think I looked at what I was afraid of and I saw him. Abigail looked at her father for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly. I think that's probably true. They ate supper without much conversation, but the quiet between them had changed again. Shifted towards something that had more room in it, less compression, the way a room feels after a window has been opened even slightly. She and Caleb walked the creek trail that evening in the dark, which they had both stopped pretending was a chance occurrence and had started treating as the scheduled thing it was. The cold was real now, properly autumn, and she had the blanket and he had borrowed a heavier coat from Earl Simmons that was too wide in the shoulders, and he knew it and didn't mention it. They walked without talking for a while, which had become one of the things she liked best, that they'd gotten past the need to fill the silence with proof that things were all right. Things were imperfect and complicated, and they both knew it. And walking in the honest quiet of that was, paradoxically, one of the most comfortable things she'd experienced in years. My father told me what he said, she said eventually, about your wife would have liked you. That cost him something, Caleb said. Most true things do. A pause. Their footsteps on the trail, the dry grass brushing against boots. I found something on the south edge of the plot today, he said. Under the leaves, near the cottonwoods, an old fence post. Someone tried to run a line there a long time ago. Probably the Carver family, she said. They had land all through there 40 years ago, before they sold it off in pieces. It's half rotted. I'll pull it out in the spring. He paused. Found some wild rosemary growing around it. I didn't pull that. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the trail ahead, neutral-faced. You left the wild rosemary, she said. It's in a good spot. Doesn't need to be cleared. She looked forward again and said nothing. But something in her chest had moved quietly in a way that she was going to allow herself to feel without immediately cataloging or containing it. He had left the wild rosemary. That was a small thing. That was, in the accounting of large events and revealed truths and broken histories and rebuilt foundations, an extremely small thing. It was also, she thought, precisely the kind of small thing that told you everything. They came back to the main street and stopped at the corner as they always did, and she turned to look at him and he looked back, and they were close in the dark, and neither of them moved for a moment. Caleb, she said. Yeah, I'm glad you came back. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with something on his face that she didn't have a name for and wasn't going to try to name, because naming it felt like it might break something that was still finding its shape. He reached out and tucked a loose piece of her hair back, just briefly, just that, and then let his hand drop. Good night, Abigail, he said. She went inside. She stood in the dark of the store and listened to her own breathing and thought about wild rosemary and cottonwood trees and a man who asked for nothing and kept showing up anyway, and she thought about the long winter ahead and the work that was still to be done, on the building and on themselves, and on the complicated, imperfect, still salvageable thing between them. She turned on the lamp. She went upstairs. Winter came to Red Hollow the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcement, just arriving one morning as a fact that everyone had known was coming and that still, somehow, managed to catch people slightly unprepared. The first real snow fell in mid-November, a heavy overnight fall that buried the street in a foot of white and left the town looking clean and temporary, the way snow makes things look before the daily business of living cuts it up into slush and mud. Caleb had the drainage ditch finished and the building site properly staked before the ground froze. That was what he'd wanted, to have the preparatory work done so that when spring came he could start immediately, without the delay of planning what should have been planned in autumn. He'd learned that from 6 years of doing things without adequate preparation. You planned ahead or you paid for it later, and he'd paid enough. He was still at the Dalton boarding house. The room was still small and still smelled like old wood and someone else's tobacco, and he had stopped noticing either of those things. He'd put up a shelf for his books, 3 of them, which was all he owned, and hung his extra coat on the back of the door, and these 2 adjustments had made it sufficiently his own. He worked at the livery every morning and helped around town in the afternoons and had supper twice a week at the Reed's back room, which had become a fact of life that no one had formally established, but that had arranged itself through repetition and the quiet consent of all parties. Her father sat at the table and offered opinions about the land and the town, and occasionally asked Caleb questions that started as practical and ended as something less easily categorized. Questions about where he'd been, what he'd seen, what he thought about things that had nothing to do with drainage ditches. Caleb answered them directly, without performance, and Henry listened in the manner of a man slowly revising a document he'd been certain was finished. It wasn't warm between them. Warmth was probably too much to expect, and none of them were expecting it. But it was honest, and honest was harder to build than warm and lasted longer. Abigail watched it happen the way you watch weather moving across open land. You can see it coming from a distance, you can track its progress, but you can't control it, and you can't entirely predict it, and the best thing you can do is stand in your own spot and see what arrives. What arrived, through November and into December, was something that looked increasingly like a family trying to remember how to be one. The night it snowed 6 inches in 3 hours and the wind came up hard from the north. Caleb stayed late at the store because the supply of firewood Abigail had stacked behind the building had gotten wet under the snow and wouldn't split cleanly. He spent an hour splitting wood by lantern light in the alley, which was cold enough that he could feel the cold in his back teeth, and stacked it under the porch overhang where it would stay dry. He went home afterward and his hands didn't stop hurting until the next morning. She found the wood the next day. She came out for it at 6 in the morning in the dark and found the neat stack under the porch, dry and properly split, and stood there for a moment in the dark and cold. She didn't mention it to him directly. Instead, when he came for supper that Tuesday, she made apple cake. He didn't say anything about the cake. She didn't say anything about the wood. Her father ate 2 pieces of cake and asked no questions, which was its own form of diplomacy. The question between them, the one neither of them had formally asked or answered, the one that had been present since the creek bank on a Sunday morning in October when she'd put her hand over his, had not gone away. It had just been moving slowly, the way things move when they're too important to rush, and both parties know it. She knew where she stood. She'd known for weeks, with the particular clarity that comes when you stop arguing with yourself and simply acknowledge the thing you've been arguing about. She was in love with him. She'd probably never stopped being in love with him, which was either a testament to something real or a failure of self-preservation, and she'd decided it didn't matter which because the feeling was the same regardless of what you called it. What she didn't know was how to step from where she was to where she wanted to be without it feeling like she was moving too fast or not fast enough, without the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between them making the next step more loaded than it needed to be. She was, in short, afraid. She was aware of being afraid, which was uncomfortable, because she'd spent 6 years telling herself she was past being afraid of things like this. Caleb was waiting. She knew he was waiting. He'd been patient in a way that was not passive, not the patience of a man who had given up pressing, but the patience of a man who was still entirely present, still entirely there, just refusing to impose a timeline on something that didn't belong to him alone. It was Martin Cross, of all people, who said the thing she'd been thinking. She was in the barber shop the week before Christmas, picking up a hat box that Martin's wife had asked her to hold, and that had ended up at the store by mistake. Martin was alone, cleaning up after his last customer of the day, and he looked at her when she came in with the expression of a man who has something to say and has been waiting for a moment to say it. "You know," he said, sweeping up hair from the floor, "some people wait until everything is perfectly resolved before they let themselves have anything. They keep the good thing at a distance until all the complicated things are tidied up first." He didn't look at her. "Problem is, things are never tidied up. You wait long enough, you're just alone with a tidy room." She stood with the hat box under her arm and looked at him. "I'm not asking for advice, Martin. I'm not giving advice. I'm making an observation." He swept a pile of hair into the dustpan. "About human nature, generally. About my human nature specifically." He looked up then. "You've been happy this fall," he said, more simply. "Happier than I've seen you in years, and every time you get close to it, you take a half step back. Like you're not sure you're allowed." She didn't answer that. She couldn't answer it with Martin watching, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. She went home and put the hat box by the door and stood at the window of the back room looking at the street below, at the snow-covered main road and the lantern light coming through the windows of the saloon and the ordinary busy dark of Red Hollow at 7 in the evening. She thought about what Martin said. She thought about what her father had said months ago. Men who leave don't change. And she thought about what she'd watched Caleb do every day since he arrived, the slow accumulation of days and work and presence that didn't announce itself and didn't require anything in return. She thought about wild rosemary left growing at the base of a fence post. She thought about wood split in the dark and cold. She put on her coat. She went to the boarding house. She knocked on the door of his room. He opened it after a moment. He'd been reading. She could see the book on the cot. And he looked at her in the doorway with that particular stillness that had stopped surprising her, the way he went very quiet when he was most paying attention. "Abigail," he said, "can I come in?" He stepped back. The room was small, and there was only the one chair which he offered her, and he sat on the cot, and the lantern on the washstand was the only light. She sat down and took her coat off and looked at him and decided to simply say the thing. "I've been holding myself at a distance from this," she said, "from you, on purpose. Because I kept waiting for everything to be settled first, for my father and me to be fully resolved, for the grief about the years we lost to pass completely, for some version of certainty I was never going to find." She looked at her hands. "I kept thinking there was a right moment, and tonight She stopped. "I'm tired of waiting for a right moment." He was very still. "I'm not saying everything is fixed," she said. "Nothing is entirely fixed. My father is still making peace with himself, and so am I, and probably we both will be for a while. And I don't have any version of the future that's certain, and I don't think you do either." She looked up at him. "But I know what I feel, and I've known it for weeks, and I've been making myself hold it carefully from a distance, and I don't want to do that anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern put warm light on his face, on the lines that hadn't been there 6 years ago, on the eyes that were the same as they'd always been. "Abigail," he said. His voice was low. "You're not saying something I don't already know. I've known where I stand since the day I rode back into this town." "I know you have," she said. "I'm saying it out loud so you know where I stand." He reached across the small distance between the cot and the chair and took her hand. Both of them held the weight of it for a moment. The simple fact of her hand in his, in a small room in December, in a town that had tried to separate them and hadn't quite managed it permanently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I want you to know that plainly. Not as a promise about the future, because promises about the future are easy. As a statement about who I am now, today, compared to who I was at 24. He paused. "I know the difference." "I know you do," she said. She stayed for an hour. They talked, but not about the past, not about the land, or the store, or her father. They talked the way they'd talked when they were young, about smaller things, about the particular quality of winter light on snow, and whether the town would look different in 10 years, and what she thought of the new school teacher who'd arrived in September and seemed to be managing the older children with a combination of homework and strategic terror that was apparently effective. He made her laugh twice, which she hadn't been expecting, and the sound of it in the small room seemed to take both of them slightly by surprise, the way a familiar thing can surprise you when you encounter it somewhere you'd stopped expecting it. When she left, she walked home through the snow in the dark, and the cold air was very clear, and the stars were sharp above Red Hollow, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person who was walking toward something rather than away from it. Winter passed the way winters do in that part of the country. Slowly, with occasional drama and extended stretches of gray tedium, cold that went on longer than expected, and then broke suddenly into a March day so warm it felt like an argument for hope. Caleb started building in late March, as planned, the ground having thawed enough to dig the foundation properly. He built the way he did other things, without haste, without shortcuts, with the stubborn attention of a man who intended what he made to last. Henry came out to the North Plot twice in April. The second time, he brought his cane and stayed for 3 hours, sitting on an upturned bucket near the south wall and making observations about the window placement and the pitch of the roof that were, Caleb noted privately, entirely correct. He incorporated 2 of Henry's suggestions without announcing he was doing so. Henry noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. By May, the frame was up, and the roof was on, and the walls were half finished, and there were people in Red Hollow who had started making visits to the North Plot on their afternoon walks with a transparency that was almost endearing. Earl Simmons came twice. Walt Briggs came once to inspect his investment, which he declared satisfactory. Martin came and walked the perimeter and nodded several times and then said, "It looks like something that'll still be here in 50 years, which for Martin was as close to rapture as things got. Abigail came on a Sunday in May when the walls were finished and the windows were in. She walked through the empty rooms in the afternoon light and stood in the main room looking at the south windows and the way the light came through them and the pale wood of the new floor and the old cottonwoods visible through the glass, their new leaves very green against the blue sky. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched her. "It's good," she said. She turned around. "It's genuinely good, Caleb." "It needs a lot still," he said. "Finishing work inside. The kitchen wants proper shelving. The porch isn't built yet." "I know. I mean the bones of it." She looked at the walls. "You can feel it in a building, whether it was built with care or just speed." She looked back at him. This one was built with care. He didn't respond to that immediately. He was looking at her in the afternoon light in the empty room, and she saw on his face the same expression she'd seen on the creek bank in October, the one she'd eventually understood was a man recognizing something he'd been afraid he'd lost. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. He came off the doorframe and walked to where she stood and stopped in front of her, close, closer than their usual careful distance. And he looked at her directly with the particular attention that had always been, she thought, one of the truest things about him. The way he looked at her like she was the whole room. "I'm not 24 anymore," he said. "I'm not standing here with a dream and an empty pocket and hoping that's enough. I've got land under the deed and a house on it and steady work and—" He stopped. "And none of that is why I'm asking. I'm not asking because I've finally got something adequate to offer. I'm asking because I should have asked 6 years ago, and I didn't, and I've spent 6 years knowing I should have, and I'm done letting time pass on this." He reached into his coat pocket. What he brought out was not a ring. She'd half expected a ring. It was a piece of wire that had been bent and twisted into a small, imperfect circle, clearly fashioned by hand, clearly recent, clearly someone who had no particular skill at metalwork doing the best they could with what was available. It was the least impressive thing she'd ever seen. It was also, she thought, the most exactly right thing she had ever seen. "I'll get something proper made," he said. "I know this isn't—" "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "Ask the question." He looked at her. "Marry me," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a command. Just the two words, plain and direct, with everything he had behind them. Not because things are resolved or because it's the right time or because it fits some version of how this was supposed to go. Because I want to build this life with you. Because I've wanted that since I was 24, and it hasn't changed, and I don't think it's going to. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the bent wire circle in his hand. She looked at his face, at the man who had come back on a worn horse and stayed when staying was uncomfortable and fixed foundations without being asked and left rosemary growing because it was in a good spot. "Yes," she said. He put the wire circle on her finger, where it sat crooked and slightly too large, and she looked down at it and laughed, short and real. And he laughed too, and it was not a perfect moment. They were standing in an unfinished house with sawdust on the floor and the smell of new wood around them, and the wire was already leaving a faint mark on her skin. But it was entirely, completely theirs. She put her other hand against his face, the way she hadn't let herself do for 6 years. He leaned into it slightly, the way you lean into warmth when you've been cold for a long time, without drama or performance. Just the honest response of a person who has been cold for a long time. They told her father that evening. Henry was at the kitchen table. He was almost always at the kitchen table now, which she'd stopped finding sad and started finding simply true. And she came in with Caleb behind her and said, "Papa." He looked up. He looked at her face, and then at Caleb's face, and then at the bent wire on her finger, which she had not taken off and was not going to take off. Something moved through his expression that was too complicated to catalog. She saw the regret in it, the specific regret of a man who understood exactly what he had nearly prevented and what it had cost. And she saw something under the regret that was older and quieter and looked, if she was reading it right, like the specific relief of a man who has been afraid something was impossible and has been shown, at last, that it isn't. "I know I don't have the right to give you my blessing," he said. His voice was rough. "I gave up that right a long time ago by the way I acted." He looked at Caleb. "But I'm telling you anyway. You have it, for whatever it's worth." Caleb held the older man's gaze. "It's worth something," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't." Henry nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I'll make coffee," which was what he said when he needed to do something with his hands. And he got up with his cane and went to the stove, and Abigail reached over and briefly took Caleb's hand, and the three of them were in the kitchen together with the lamp burning and the coffee starting to smell like coffee. And it wasn't the family any of them had originally planned. It was built wrong and repaired badly in places, and it had a crack running through it that would probably always be visible if you knew where to look. But it was standing. That was the thing. It was standing, and it was theirs, and it was real. They were married in September, a year after he'd ridden back into town. It wasn't a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. Martin Cross stood up with Caleb. Dorothy Alcott, who had once spent 15 minutes telling Abigail not to worry about men like Caleb Mercer, arrived with a cake and the expression of a woman who intends to claim some portion of credit for how things turned out. Earl Simmons came. Walt Briggs came. The schoolteacher whose name was actually Margaret and who had won the respect of the entire town came and brought 6 students because they'd apparently been following the story from a distance with the unashamed investment of children who understand that this is better than their regular lessons. Henry walked Abigail to where Caleb was standing in front of the new house, which still smelled like fresh timber and had a porch on it now, with the cottonwoods behind it going gold and orange in the autumn light. He walked slowly with his cane, and she matched his pace. And when they stopped, she looked at his face, and he was not crying. Her father was not a man who cried, had never been. But his eyes were very bright, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was controlling something strongly felt. "I'm sorry," he said. "One more time." Quietly, under the noise of the gathered people. "I'm sorry for the years." She took his hand. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She looked at him the way you look at someone you have chosen, in full knowledge of their flaws, to love anyway. "Now let's not spend any more of them looking backward." He squeezed her hand once, then he placed it in Caleb's. The years that followed were not easy years. Easy was not the word for a life built on 40 acres of frontier land with a livery job and a general store and a man whose back gave out every winter and needed tending. The store had a bad season in the second year when the railroad men came through and then left and took most of the passing trade with them, and they spent 4 months being careful with money in the way that is genuinely stressful and not romantic at all. There were disagreements, real ones, the kind that last more than an evening and require the kind of honest conversation that is tiring and necessary and can't be avoided without making things worse. Abigail had opinions, and so did Caleb, and their opinions did not always point the same direction. But there was something under all of it that held. Not because they were exceptional people. They were not exceptional. They were a woman who'd built a shell of competence around something that had been hurt, and a man who'd spent 6 years running from a wound rather than looking at it, and a father who had loved badly and paid for it and was slowly, imperfectly, doing better. None of them were exceptional. They were ordinary people trying to live honestly, which is both less romantic and more demanding than most stories make it sound. Their daughter was born the following spring, in the room with the south windows, in the house Caleb had built on the north plot, with Henry Reed's suggestions incorporated in the walls. They named her Clara, which was Abigail's mother's name, which made Henry sit at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking when they told him. By the time Clara was old enough to walk to the store on her own and back, Red Hollow had changed around them in the ways that towns change. Some things gone, some things new. The railroad finally coming through properly on the south route and bringing with it people and business and the general disruption of progress. The store expanded. The livery expanded. Caleb took on 2 men to help. Abigail hired a girl named Ruth to work the counter 3 mornings a week, which was the first help she'd accepted in 4 years of being asked. Henry was 70, and his back was mostly a memory of what a back could do, but his mind was sharp, and his opinions were intact, and he sat in the store most mornings in a chair that had been placed specifically for him, in the spot where the light was good. And he talked to the customers and told them things about Red Hollow that only someone who'd been there long enough would know. People asked for him by name. That had surprised him, the first time. Abigail had been watching for it. She watched it and didn't say anything because some things are better received without comment. Caleb came in from the field one evening in late October. Clara was 4 years old and had been following him around the north plot for most of the afternoon in the manner of a small person who believed strongly that all adult activities were improved by her presence. And he found Abigail on the porch in the last of the evening light with a cup of tea and the kind of quiet expression she got when she'd been thinking. He sat on the porch steps and Clara climbed on him with the efficiency of a child for whom a seated adult is primarily a climbing structure, and he settled her against his side and looked at Abigail. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at the land. The cottonwoods were gold this year, very gold, one of those autumns when the color was remarkable, and the evening light on them had that particular quality that made things look simultaneously vivid and temporary. "I was thinking about what we almost didn't have," she said. She said it simply, without weight. Not in a sad way, just, "Sometimes I look at this and I think about how close it came to just not existing, all of it." She looked at Clara settled against Caleb's side. This porch, the way the light looks right now." She looked at him. "And then I think about how the only reason it almost didn't exist was fear. His fear and yours and mine. All three of us afraid of different things, and all three of us handling it badly in our own specific way." Caleb was quiet. "The thing I keep arriving at," she said, "is that fear is not a good reason to let go of things. I know that sounds simple, but I spent 6 years thinking that careful and protected meant I was fine. And I was fine, I was functional. I was running the store and taking care of Papa and getting through the days, but I wasn't—" She stopped. "I wasn't living on the inside of my life, the way I told you I wanted to when we were 19. He looked at her across the porch. "You said that once," he said. "I remembered it for 6 years." "I know you did." She set down her cup. "I remembered it too. I just forgot to apply it." The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind. Claire had fallen asleep against Caleb's side with the complete commitment that small children bring to sleep, as if unconsciousness were a full-body decision. He held her carefully, one hand against her back. "We got here," he said. "We got here," she agreed. "The long way, the long way. Through a letter and a lie, and 6 years of separate grief, and a man who came back on a worn horse to a town that wasn't sure it wanted him. Through cold evenings on a dry creek bank and a bent wire ring, and a father who walked his daughter to where she should have been years earlier, leaning on his cane, doing the only right thing left to do. Through all of it, and out the other side, and onto this porch, in this light, with this life. It was not the life any of them had originally planned. It had wrong turns and cracks, and the kind of history that you don't erase, only carry more honestly over time. But it was real in a way that things are only real when they've been tested, when they've been doubted, when someone had to make a choice to come back and someone had to make a choice to let them. The frontier had not broken them. It hadn't been that generous. What it had done was harder and more valuable. It had stripped away everything that wasn't real, everything that was convenient or assumed or built on someone else's fear, and left only what could withstand the stripping. And what remained, when you got to the bottom of it, was this. 2 people sitting on a porch in the last of the autumn light, with a sleeping child between them, in a house that had been built with care. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was what the years had been building toward, in their long, imperfect, entirely human way. It was finally home.